we wouldn't be here today without these folks. They are the ones that are ringing the bell and telling us we got to do something. So we have great other folks who have joined us, and I'm so pleased that they're here for this panel. First, Max Fisher, who's an international journalist with the New York Times. He's been working in this overall space for some time. He recently came out with a book called The Chaos Machine, and I got it when I first heard about it and read it cover to cover in a day, and it is the best chronology that I could ever see, or you could ever see, of the problems that result from what you just heard about all around the world. Ethnic, genocide and so on and so on. He'll talk about that in a minute. We also have Jason, who is Director of Research and Technology Ethics at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is a policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. And you just need to know, I grew up in a Baptist church in St. Louis. Yeah, you got. And so I really appreciate you being here. And he's, I think, a professor and an author, and he's done 2 books. One is Following Jesus in the Digital Age, and AI and the Future of Humanity. So you're in the right place at the right time. And finally, we have Nora Benavidez. Did I say it right? If I mangle it, I'm sorry. She's a civil rights and constitutional lawyer. She's senior counsel and director of digital justice and civil rights at an organization called Free Press. And she leads the organization around media accountability to defend against threats to democracy. So we got a great panel for you to hear from now. So I'll throw out some questions, and then we'll hope to have time at the end for any of you that want to ask them anything you want to ask them. So I'm going to start with Max. When did you first, you've been in this space for some time, and you've been reporting on all kinds of different stories that express what's happening. When did you really begin to understand the threat that all of this presents to democracy? And when did you begin to examine, genocide and violence that was going on around the world?
So like Francis, I came to this starting out in the developing world and then following it back to the United States. I was in Myanmar in 2017, reporting on the genocide there, which was this explosion of very sudden racial violence that was partly organized and was partly bottom up, was just neighbor against neighbor racial violence that was tearing this country apart. And when I was there reporting on it, it was just inescapable that social media was everywhere, not just in extremists that were using it, not just in misinformation that was coursing through it, but everyday people were getting driven and compelled into this horrific, unthinkable behavior by partly a lot of time that they were spending on social media and the effect it was having on them. Up until that point, I had, I think, the same impression that maybe a lot of people had or still have about social media, which is that its effects are mostly on the margins. That's it. Its extremists might happen to organize there, that ultra partisans might get a little bit of a boost there, that if there's bad actors, they might be able to exploit it. But that for most of us, it's something that is kind of fine or incidental, and something that Myanmar started to open my eyes to, although it took a little bit longer after that, was that its predominant effect is through everyday people. It's through basically us, those of us who think that it doesn't affect us, who think that we're the good ones, that, it is not distorting us, that it's changing society as a whole by changing individual users at a subtle level, but at the level of billions of people that has this effect. And I started to come to that when I would travel other places in the world, and I would hear over and over stories that sounded incredibly similar to what was happening in Myanmar or what was happening in the United States, where you had this Trump phenomenon, this kind of polarization that's everywhere, this racial hatred that was everywhere, that seemed to link back to social media. And that became the start for me of this 5-year project to try to understand, okay, what does social media actually do to us as an individual, as societies? And that was a lot of working with social scientists, a lot of working with psychologists, neuroscientists, people were trying to study it empirically and to understand that effect. And I think the number one takeaway that I came out of from that is that these effects on the margins, like you were talking about, the kind of cases that don't seem obviously connected, that these are just surface level indicators of changes that are happening to all of us as individuals, because this is what the platforms are designed to do. They are designed very deliberately and consciously, not to instill hate, that's not something anybody wants, but to manipulate how you think and especially how you behave in order to make you spend more time, not just reading things on the platform, but to have certain emotional reactions that are going to be conducive to the company's bottom lines, and especially to take certain behaviors. And we know now, because there's empirical evidence showing this, that changes how you think, how you behave, and especially how you relate to the wider world through, for example, politics, through identity, through things like race or religion. It changes who you are when you are offline. And the totality of that is, I think, the most important thing to understand about social media, and the fact that this emerges not from, oh, there's some edge cases, some, things that should have been moderated out of the platforms, but from the core design, which is to maximize engagement. And this is not entirely Silicon Valley's fault. It's just human nature that when you are maximizing for engagement, the emotions and the behaviors that you are pulling out are hatred, othering, in-grouping, out-grouping, fear, suspicion, and things that, especially when you are designing platforms that relate through really important critical human activities like consuming information, relating to your community, relating to your friends, that has an enormous effect on society as a whole, even if the effect on you as an individual might be subtle to the point where it is almost imperceptible of one person.
And as I remember, you saw this in Brazil, in a very different country. You've seen it in Hungary and other places in the world. Is that not correct?
Absolutely. And I would say that what was really instructive for me was the pattern and seeing how universal it is, because it's easy to look at the United States and say, well, there are lots of causes of our moment of democratic and political crisis, which is true, of course. But when you see that same pattern plays out over and over again in one society after another in very, very similar ways, it becomes much harder to escape the conclusion that there's something fundamental about this technology that brings these things out.
Jason and Nora, you're in touch with different communities, but you're seeing, I assume, the same problem demonstrate itself, Jason, with the religious communities that you're involved with. Maybe you could talk about that first and tell us how you see this.
Yeah, well, one, I want to say thank you for being here and being on a panel like this and amongst so many experts in this room. It's a real honor. Exactly what he's saying here, what Max is saying, is that I think for at least in religious communities, specifically, I'll speak for the Christian church that I'm a member of, so I don't want to speak for all faiths. Historically, the church has seen technology as just merely a tool. It was a tool that we use. We can use it for good or for bad, but inherently was neutral. And I think for many of us, philosophically speaking, that's kind of how we approach technology. It was just a tool that we use. It can be used by bad actors, but can be used for immense good as well. And there's an element of truth to that. But at least within our faith tradition and our community over the last few years, especially in the midst of the pandemic, that was kind of, to me, the pandemic wasn't just we were all kind of forced online, but it almost sped up what was going to happen in probably 10 or so years, and it compressed it into about a year. And so we saw kind of this rush, especially in our communities, of almost panic about the ways that social media was changing us. But that didn't seem to make sense with what the way we approach technology was just merely a tool. And so one of the things that I've done in my writing and my work and research is to kind of reframe the way that we approach technology, especially from a Christian perspective, to say it's not merely a tool. It is a tool that we use. We do have moral agency and accountability for the things. We are responsible for the things that we view and how we interact with those things. But the flip side of it too, it's also a tool that's deeply shaping us. And we're seeing this across communities. This isn't just a religious thing. This is non-Christian. This is other faiths. This is kind of across the world. The way that technology is shaping and forming us into particular types of people, because there is that inherent design. And I think that kind of revelation is, at least in my community, is starting to wake people up a little bit, to say, okay, something else is going on here, because we're not only seeing this in polarization and tribalization. If you don't know, and I don't encourage you to check it out, Christian Twitter is kind of a hot mess sometimes. But you go into these places and they're full of vitriol and hate. They're full of just infighting and tribalization. And it's nasty. It's almost like a cesspool. It's not something I even want to encourage people to join almost. But this is happening across platforms, especially in places like Facebook, where we've seen through a lot of Francis's work and other work, reports that many of the top Christian Facebook pages were actually run by Eastern European troll farms. So much of the content that was being spread, while it may be a verse or two or a meme or something like that, it's subtly shaping and altering the way that we see God. It's shaping the way that we view ourselves as human beings and seeing the world around us, including our neighbors. And so that's one of the things I think there's kind of a realization to the way that technology is not merely a tool that we use, but it's actually a tool that's deeply shaping and forming us and in many ways using us.
Nora, you're in relation to different local communities and state communities. How do you see this, and what do you see happening with the groups you relate to and interact with?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I feel like this is off. It is off. Jason's got me. Thanks, Jason. Well, it's great to be here with all of you. I didn't really ever set out to work on digital issues. I'll be really honest. You know, my background was as a lawyer. I worked on constitutional issues, the most exciting issues in my mind, and I can sell you on that later when we get to happy hour. But sort of like the real, the corporeal, if you will, the way that we connect to democracy in real life. And so I would work with protesters to make sure that there were equitable points of entry for people to engage and speak across viewpoints, that journalists could engage in really meaningful ways with government and have access to that. There were so many of these exciting moments throughout, and this is now for over a decade. And frankly, clients would come to me and more and more and more talk about things they saw online. I would get calls from communities when I was litigating, asking me if I could fact check. This is early days, like 2014, 15. I think of like the early hopeful Obama era of the internet when we were still very excited about certain aspects. And I would get clients who would call me and say, can you fact check this thing? This is happening on the ground, we think. And so I kept kind of avoiding it. I was like, I don't want to work on digital issues. I'm not going to fact check what happened online. But it just really rose to the point where it felt for me like it was a fever pitch, that everything was an entry point to digital information and engagement. And more than anything else, that the digital, not just social media, but our digital experiences were the frontier for civil rights. And it wasn't enough then to just talk about the way we would engage at the ballot box. But what were the steps before that that prevented someone getting to the ballot box? And so it took me a long time personally to get to the point where now I see these people as colleagues and it's really exciting. I didn't set out to do that, but I just, the long arc of all of this seems to point to that this digital ecosystem informs everything we do. And so I don't think I'm saying anything new for this group, but that's sort of how I came to that realization, that if we are going to tackle the ways that people, everyday people, let's not forget that this is not abstract. This affects everyday people all over the country, and it affects everyday people all over the world. If we are going to tackle the issues that lead to inequities around the world, we have to look at this digital realm. So in practice, what that meant is I started asking clients things like, when I was still litigating, what would you like to see happen? And the recurring comment I got was that people always wanted to be able to live as full agents of their lives. And Carrie, I'm so glad you mentioned at the top that we want to empower people. It isn't enough to just mitigate harm. It isn't enough to just somehow push back the spread of harmful and malign issues online that all of these experts know so well. it is equally important that then we build up, that we bootstrap up real people so that they are engaged and able to access and empowered to know what they are looking at online. Of course, a lot of this civil rights work has, taken me to communities that do not speak English, that are communities of color, Black voters, non-English voters. Myself, I am Latina. I work extensively in the Spanish-speaking and Latino community. Those are just sort of inflection points, and every single community at the local level exhibits and digests things very differently. And so it's difficult in this type of setting when we have so little time to go through the textures of the way different micro communities are dealing with these issues. Similar to the way Jason, I think in many ways, has sort of tried to give you this 50,000-foot view of what we're dealing with. But at the end of the day, data has been collected about each of us. It has been analyzed, retained, sold to the point where our experiences are not our own. And what that means is that that fundamental thing so many of my clients wanted, to be able to live as full agents of their own lives, they are not able to do. We are not able to do. And the way it might seem obvious in the real world when there is a very clear-cut, let's call it violation, I'm going to use a lawyer term, a constitutional violation of some sort, it doesn't feel so obvious in the digital sphere. And so part of what I think our job is first is to help make real, to remove the abstractness of this problem for people. At least that's what I do at Free Press. That is the work that I think motivates a lot of my colleagues in the civil rights and human rights arena. I know that motivates Maria Ressa, who has been tremendous on this issue. And then I think the other is to publicly, as a council here, showcase how you build consensus publicly and how you do that in the most meaningful and bipartisan ways, cross-partisan ways. So I'm really excited for us to be able to get moving on that, because we have to do both at the same time. And I think we can.
That's fabulous. You were all unbelievably good. So thank you so much. I asked a question of everybody, and this may not be the right question, but I recently read a book by Shoshana Zuboff, who maybe you've all read it, and I talked to her for an hour and a half on the phone the other day, and she said, Dick, you have to understand that there are symptoms of this problem, and that's what you're mainly talking about: kids, community, national security, all that, which we've been talking about today. But she said you have to get to the root cause of why this is happening. And in her view, and she said there's no magic solution to this, but she thought privacy legislation to cut off the surveillance machine would be a good place to start. So I'd throw that out to the group. Or do you have other things that you think? Tristan and Francis talked about some little changes you could make within the mechanism that could help. So go with that.
One of the major challenges around, so Tristan actually mentioned this before, that we have frameworks that we have in the past used to solve similar problems. And so it's easy for us to fall back on them. It's like antitrust. Antitrust is super important. It's not going to automatically solve the problems around algorithms, because these algorithms are attractive.
And antitrust are just going to have new folks competing for a bad incentive to
The same
continue to pursue the race to the bottom of the brainstem. So all of these things are partial.
Privacy is really important, right? People deserve to have control over their data, but almost everything around privacy, people still can consent to give up their data. And what we see is these algorithms are seductive. Like if you have someone choose between a chronological feed or a chronological feed with some spam demotion and a perfectly tuned to your brain algorithmic feed that's like seductive, people will give up their data for that. And so privacy is an important part of the solution. Antitrust is an important part of the solution, but we need to start saying, what is this third way, fourth way to deal with the modern incentives of the system that's creating these problems?
I totally agree. And I think that the other dynamic is, again, this arms race for the perverse incentive. So if I don't do it, the other guy will. If Facebook said, gosh, you know what? Francis is 100% right. We're just going to stop everything that we're doing. Well, then TikTok just comes in and eats the lunch. And then now, just like, imagine if in the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union running television programming and Sesame Street and Saturday morning cartoons for the entire world. So we don't want that outcome. And we have to look at how all of these actors are competing for this finite resource of the attention commons, the engagement commons, or the public conversational democracy commons. There's many ways to frame what that commons is, but we haven't had laws for that. We did have, there was an article recently writing about the Noise Control or Noise Reduction Act, that once there started to be this really, and you would know more about this, but this increase in the amount of just background noise in our environment, we don't need a right to protect our quiet until we have noise everywhere. Well, I think we need to start innovating our forms of law and philosophy to match the actual problem set instead of just going back to what we know. Shoshana is right. And the thing about, just really quick about privacy, imagine if the Oracle in the Matrix, when she tells Neo, and don't worry about the vase, and he says, what vase? And he turns around and he knocks over the vase. So her saying, don't worry about the vase, caused him to do the thing that would actually, be the thing. Imagine she could place a stock trade on the market saying, I'm going to bet $1 million that Neo's going to bump over the vase. Well, imagine she's in a feedback loop where she literally can calculate, like an AI, the perfect thing to say to cause and enact any outcome, and then place trades on a market that I can make money anytime I'm right. And every time I'm right, I get more resources, which get reinvested back where? Into a bigger supercomputer that's better at predicting Neo's next move. So that's the runaway loop that Shoshana is talking about that we have to address.
The thing I wanted to hit about agency. So that's the real question. So we have systems that treat us as subjects. We have software where we have a unilateral king. We have seen people like Mark Zuckerberg. We have these companies. They treat us like subjects. We have to follow their rules. We have to accept the rules of the game. They don't treat us like citizens, right? We're not agents in those systems. And I think the kinds of conversations we need to have around, like, how do we create incentives such that we can have systems where we have participation even on platforms in terms of the governance of those platforms.
I'm happy to jump in with just a little more texture as well. I would agree. And I think that privacy is one of several priorities that we need to focus on. There's a case currently, Vargas v. Facebook, now Meta, a case that I think helps give some color to all of this. And it really is about why privacy, or what privacy means, what is happening with our data on a lot of these platforms. It is not unique to social media is what's interesting. And I think so many of the people here understand that. But this is happening pretty pervasively. And so this one case is part of a larger body of work where both the US government and other private individuals have seen that it looked like for many years, Facebook was doing something with what people were given to see. And we didn't quite know what it was. It was like, certain users are seeing certain things and then certain users are seeing other. It's almost as if some people are placed into categories. And so DOJ has looked into this, the Department of Justice. They just settled a case with Meta in which Meta admitted that its algorithms, particularly around housing, are in fact discriminatory. The Vargas case is about a set of individuals who are all users of color and the ways that they have been excluded from seeing certain content. The premise being that we've seen and we now know that Facebook would create composite profiles of people based on their attitudes, their behaviors on social media, literally the likes, dislikes, the things that they are part of in groups, and that those composite identities were then used to place people into what are called cohorts. The cohorts then were given content or excluded from seeing certain content. And the premise of this case is, in fact, that certain cohorts, based on users who are of color and minorities of certain protected classes, are excluded from seeing content like housing ads or ads about loans or other things that would give them equal opportunity, to use a term of art, to live in the same ways that other users who are their white counterparts are actually able to do by seeing certain content. So that is an extremely reductive description of this case, but part of what we're seeing more and more is that basically the composite profiles of us dictate what our experiences are. And so our data, the things we do online, and the way that then that gets analyzed and used is one piece of this larger problem. We should be tackling transparency, disclosures, of course, but when it comes to privacy, we have to be able to talk about it in bite-sized ways to help people understand that that's really the agency quotient. That is what is preventing us from understanding why our experience isn't really shaped by us. It's shaped by what these larger forces and business models are creating for us.
So I, as a newspaper reporter, of course, have no opinions whatsoever on the proper way to deal with any major challenges of our time. But I will say I feel like I've generally heard two kind of categories of ways to think about tackling this problem. And I think of them as the idealist case and the realist case. And the idealist case I kind of think of as starting from this premise that it is possible to have a social media platform that provides the good that come from these platforms and this technology, which is true. There's a lot of good there, and that mitigates the harm. And one of the reasons to believe there's something to this is that we used to actually have that social media. If you go back to 06, 07, 08, you had platforms that did not have those engagement maximizing features and that were much more neutral and that provided a lot of the good that we associate with things like the Arab Spring, but much less of the harm. Now, those companies were a lot less profitable. And of course, that's a genie you can't entirely put back in the bottle, but there are a lot of really sophisticated, really smart ideas for how you engineer incentives such that this industry and this market will get a little bit closer to that version of social media. And the more realist case that I've heard, or I think the people who advocate for it would call it the realist case, is that on some level, these are cigarette companies and their product is inherently addictive and meant to be addictive. And that form of addiction is inherently harmful. And you're not going to convince Marlboro to make a healthy cigarette. And you're not going to convince Camel to take the chemicals and the nicotine out of their product because that's their business and that's what their product is. And if you look at the history of...
But isn't that why we prosecuted them?
Right.
Just
Well,
to be clear.
Exactly. Right. And the a lot of this regulation and the action around cigarette companies is not about make a better cigarette, although they do, there were some changes around the margins, but cigarettes still kill you. They still give you cancer. But so much of that effort has been about interrupting the company's relationship to their consumers, and especially vulnerable consumers like kids, which is also the case with social media, because we know that both the addictiveness and the effects of social media are heightened for adolescents and youths and for other certain types of people, but just generally trying to mitigate how easy it is and how desirable it is to get and use these products. And that's something that took 60 years and is still ongoing, and still a lot of people smoke cigarettes. So there's ways that model is not attractive because it means that it's a generational and maybe permanent problem that just gets managed. But I do see how people arrive at the case that it's very tough to engineer companies' incentives away from like the core of market capitalism, basically.
And I want to emphasize one thing real quick, because even I wasn't aware of this when I started this work. When we talk about kids, with cigarettes, we were like, we want to make sure that like 16-year-olds don't see like the cooler 18-year-old and they want cigarettes, or 15-year-olds. I used to talk about 11-year-olds. I was like, oh, the problem is 11-year-olds. And I went to a mom's conference. And they're like, no, the problem is 8-year-olds. Right. So let's remember when we talk about kids, we're really talking about kids.
Yeah, and can you guys, I don't think this one's working. So set that off to the side. There's so much wisdom here, and there's so much wisdom in this room for these type of issues. And one of the things that I try to do in my work is remind us not to just find kind of that simplistic solution, because we often want to find that magic bullet that's going to fix everything. And there are a lot of these bullets that I think can fix things. We should be having conversations about regulating the industry. We should be having conversations about the role of government in these things, as well as kind of our moral and personal agency and responsibility. But one of the things I've noticed in this conversation, even today here, is that we're often utilizing words like privacy. And when I say privacy, I might have an inherent assumption of what that means that's different than what you mean. And part of what I've noticed, especially in these conversations, is that one of the most unifying kind of cross-partisan support, there's amazing potential. We're bringing the left and the right and the center all together to say there's a problem with technology. The problem is what happens when we get in that room and say there's a problem. What do we do about it? We all have different viewpoints because we all see things a little bit different. And the beauty of something like this council and the work that this council can do is to bring us together to have these conversations. part of my research, specifically as a moral philosopher, is diving into how do Christians specifically understand a right to privacy. I mean something very different by the right to privacy than maybe kind of a normal kind of liberal understanding, or especially in light of a lot of autonomy. This is one of the things we saw with the fallout of the Dobbs decision, was a massive kind of emphasis on a right to privacy and what that meant, because many of these Supreme Court decisions were based on that. And I'm not getting into litigating the actual decision. One, I'm not a lawyer, and two, that's not the purpose of our time together. But it is interesting how a lot of these rights travel together and how we talk about them and what we mean by them. And so that's one of the things that I like about this kind of council and this kind of room, is that we can have those discussions, because we're not having them online. We're not having them really, because we often kind of, whether it's through social media or just life, we kind of segment off into our insulated bubbles, and we rarely kind of talk to people who disagree with us and actually clarify, what do you mean when you say that? Can you help me understand a little bit more of your perspective? And that's something I'm trying to do from a religious standpoint, because there's a lot of assumptions about what Christians believe, or what people of faith believe, or what, quote, liberals believe, or conservatives believe, or whatever. But having some of that conversation, I think, is helpful as we take a more holistic approach, because I don't want to just say, well, I don't want to scapegoat. And that's one of the things that I fear in these conversations, is that we scapegoat, saying it's really the technology industry's fault. Everything was fine before we had that. Well, yeah, that was a major catalyst. But as I've always said in my work, technology didn't really expose new questions or challenges per se. It basically put them on steroids. We're asking the same old questions we've always asked as society, as humanity, in light of these new opportunities. So what technology is expanding our moral horizons, allowing us to do things at a scale and a pace that were never possible before. And so that's where I think we need to have some of those kind of meta, not to get super philosophical here, and not about Facebook, but these type of questions behind the questions and the assumptions, and challenge those. And I think that'll lead to a lot more productive dialogue kind of as we move forward and thinking about what do we do as a society in light of these challenges.
That was all excellent. I'll ask a question now of the Max and Tristan and Francis, but the others can chime in if you want. So if we look at these platforms, these companies and their leadership, from what you've said, I think they probably know what's going on with their platform, and they probably, well, that's my question, is do they know the problems that are being created? And Max, you've probably interviewed some of them, I think. And if they don't, then how do we get them to understand it as a starter? But is there any hope that we could have this group and many other groups like it could have an interaction with them to get them to change their behavior?
There's a concept in theology called invincible ignorance. So invincible ignorance is like, if you cannot believe in God, like if there's something that holds you and you cannot change your mind, you can't be damned for that because you were invincibly ignorant. And there is a huge, profound problem at Meta, which is there's an ideology inside the company that all these bad things have always existed. They've always existed. Facebook is just a mirror. You're mad that you can see them now. They add so much more good to the world. Cars kill people too. We don't say, wait, let's get rid of cars. And there is from a top down, because Mark Zuckerberg has 56% of the votes, he only lets people stand around him who tell him that. And all the way down, if you try to raise negative issues, you're seen as a person who's suspicious. And so there is a profound thing where the only way Facebook will change is if we help them change.
There's a great quote by Upton Sinclair that appears for the last decade of all this work, which is, you can't get someone to question something that their salary depends on them not seeing. So fundamentally, that is the thing. I don't think Zuckerberg actually is reckoning with these problems, him specifically. I don't say that out of spite. I don't really care about one company or the other. I see the system. I think Jack Dorsey actually has reckoned with that. I think that he thinks the problem is unsolvable under its current model, and that's why he was excited to have Elon come in. There's actually many problems with that, but we should get into later, because I think in the short term, I just want to add something that hasn't been said. I think what happens with Twitter and Elon in the next 2 years will have dramatic consequences for civil war type dynamics and polarization in the next elections. And for those who think that Twitter is a very small fraction of people who use it, it's important to remember that the most influential class uses it every single day. And if Twitter has distorting funhouse mirror dynamics where currently the research shows by More in Common, great organization, by the way, More in Common, we did a podcast episode with their director on perception gaps, which is what they showed is that the more you use social media and Twitter, the less good you are at estimating what other people in your tribe and what other tribes believe. So it's the opposite of becoming more informed, you're becoming less informed. And when then you have journalists who live in the funhouse mirror, because journalists are one of the most attending audiences on Twitter specifically, and you have them live in the funhouse mirror, and then they write articles that the rest of the world lives in. So we're all users of Twitter downstream. Even if you've literally never even heard of Twitter, you are using Twitter by your brain running thoughts that people who live in Twitter are thinking.
I'll give you a concrete example. I got interviewed for a profile maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and they were like, Francis, why are you on the road so much? Like, you speak at all these conferences. And I was like, well, people come up to me all the time after conferences and said, I had no idea. I had no idea it was this bad. And the journalist looked at me and goes, how could that possibly be true? Right. He had no concept that the ideas that he knew about were
Right.
universal.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah. So I mean, to your question about, you know, how do you reach people in these companies, the people who have the power? You know, they have all the evidence to know this. And I think to some degree, it's financial incentive that points away from it. In some degree, I think it's just human nature. I've talked to a lot of people who are kind of more at the like mid to senior level, and nobody wants to get up in the morning and believe that they played a role in genocide in Myanmar. That's not a fact that you can let into your head. And one of my big takeaways from studying social media is that we all have a lot of psychological frailties, and that's just as true of the people who work at these companies. Something I feel like I've glimpsed maybe around the margins, and you all have a much better sense for whether there's any truth to this, is that the kind of ideological convictions that social media is inherently a force for good and that rewiring society is a force for good are maybe softening slightly, especially if you go the further down you go the ranks in the company, there's maybe a little bit less of commitment there. And I don't know how or whether you reach those people, but there's an incredible amount of market power. The people who work at these companies, the engineers at this company have just tremendous sway that, I mean, that the rest of us would only dream of.
It's worth just mentioning that that's why it's always been part of our strategy that you have to actually also go for the internal employees, and their own consciousness creates internal friction, which says, I don't want to work at a company that's driving genocides. And when the price of retaining and attracting the best talent goes up, Facebook, as you told me once, I think has had to triple their incoming salaries.
I said, I had a friend who went and shopped around. So in Silicon Valley, you often take like 2 weeks of vacation so that you can go and interview at a whole bunch of companies at exactly the same time, so you get all the offers at the same time. And he had gotten like 8 offers, and he went with Facebook because it was 30% higher than the next highest offer. Right. So the market premium is very high right now.
But those costs are going up because there's more and more awareness. And I do think that people now see it as doing like a tour of duty and seeing if they can make it better, while starting with the assumption that, hey, there's actually now a problem here because we've seen Social Dilemma or whatever. Did you want to?
Yeah, I know we're winding down time-wise, but you know, it's interesting. I have to gut check myself sometimes. I've never worked within a social media company, but I know so many wonderful people within social media companies that there is a bit of an odd moment where I, in my own sort of advocacy role and thinking about what want social media to do, have to sometimes pause. And I love hearing Francis from the inside being able to then sort of, you know, bring that voice through, Tristan, bring that voice through. It's funny, these people are some of the best people I've worked with when I work with people within companies who really want to fix or address a problem. And it isn't that it's just too big, but that there are so many facets and contours, wrinkles of all of the different teams that engage. If it's a global company, which, you know, at this point they all are, how do you interface with different teams across the globe? One thing that I am really glad that we have brought out today is the question of global and language disparity, because that is one that has, I think, really not been surfaced enough. Francis, yes,
This is
I
my
love it. I love it so
soapbox
much. I
issue.
mean, 87% of one company, Meta, was towards, resourcing of English content. Like that's frankly racism. And so we have to be able to call these things what they are. I think then let's bring up another platform in one anecdote, which is when we're trying to understand, do these companies know what's happening? I look at YouTube. In the last quarter, they removed 4.5 million videos for being violative of their policies. That is so many hours, and I don't have the number, but it is so many hours of time that it took months and months and months to review that by humans and AI. And by the time it was then removed, they have touted that as a success. And that is potentially, like I sit here and I say, that's great, wonderful. Tell me how many videos exist on the platform then. I want to know what the denominator is. And I don't get a response. I can't find it online. My researchers can't find it online. And so we are living in a vacuum of credible denominators and scale. We're looking at a problem from the outside where we don't actually know. Great, 4.5 million is potentially meaningful. It also could be 0.1% of violative videos. It could be 13% of violative videos. And then the question is, what is violative? And how do we really bring that to any meaningful definition? And so there are layers and layers and layers to get to the point where we could even say these companies do know. And I'll just sort of close by saying the flip on the legal side of invincible ignorance is reckless disregard. And I think that that is what we are dealing with. And so it is powerful to think of this as invincible ignorance. It's also reckless disregard.
What a great panel. I could listen to them all afternoon. So thank you for being here and sharing with us. And we're going to hope to get more information out of you as the day goes on. Give them a huge hand for what they've done. Yeah. Okay, questions from the audience? Anything that anybody wants to ask these great people? Fire away. Yes. If you'd identify yourself.
Yeah, hi, Paul Dempsey. I'm with ENT. A lot of this seems to come down to responsibility. And therefore, the elephant in the room, and I suppose I'm going to ask the question why we haven't done anything about it, is striking down Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and making these platforms more responsible for the content they distribute.
230?
I'm happy to take a stab at it. So I have very deep thoughts on Section 230 because it's one of those we don't in some ways know what's going to happen if we strike it down. In many ways, and I think understandably, we think if we make these platforms liable for the content on the platforms, obviously they'll take it more seriously. The other side of that is that they actually might just start taking down everything. Because they'll actually over moderate. So this is one of the moderation questions that's really interesting to me between conservatives and liberals traditionally is that, and I'm speaking with a very broad brush here, so forgive me. Traditionally, there's one camp that wants to have more moderation. We need to take down hate speech. We have stricter policies on these things. We need to limit disinformation and hate speech. Those are the two big issues. The flip side of that is often conservatives say we are already moderating too much. And so if you strike it 230, and one of my the things that we've talked a lot about as our organization myself is we actually need to reform it. Because I think there actually are some very good parts of that statute. I mean, one of the things it was not just an unlimited liability card. It's worded like that in many ways, but it was not an exchange or requiring, but it was encouraging good faith content moderation for lewd, lascivious, and all types of different content. And then it says, and otherwise objectionable. The problem is that Congress left this so vague that these platforms naturally are taking otherwise objectionable to include a whole lot of issues that may or may not should be up there. And what's happening is that shaping our public discourse. So I'm concerned at just striking it down because we do know that it did in many ways help to propel the modern internet, which has a lot of problems. I'm not acting like it's perfect, but I am saying there was some benefit to that. I'm just nervous about striking it down instead of reforming it. And one of the things that I'm a little nervous about, especially right now with the court just taking up the Gonzalez v. Google case, is what is the court going to do? And I'm a conservative. I'm unabashedly a conservative, but more importantly, I'm a Christian. One of the things I'm concerned about is that the court will begin to legislate or to clarify where this is Congress's job. Congress needs to, if we're going to reform it, let's reform it. Let's clarify, because it's not 1996 anymore. And those things need to be, in my opinion, need to be reformed rather than overhauled or just repealed, because I don't know about those unintended consequences or unattended effects of just removing it. Not just breaking the internet, which may be a good thing for some of us, but in many ways, I don't know what that's going to do to these platforms and how they're going to react. And they're not going to react exactly the same. And that concerns me, to say what's actually going to happen here. So my appeal is to say, instead of repealing it, or let's actually seek to reform it and to clarify and make this and update the statute to what the internet actually is, not what it used to be or what we want it or what we hoped it would be.
Nick?
Can we get more specific about what reforming 230 would look like? Because I think that that's the value of the council here. Like you got people in the room who are all really interested in specific solutions. Having been a former newspaper editor, we couldn't put anything in the newspaper that I edited unless it was fact checked completely, including letters to the editor. I helped start Huffington Post and was at HuffPost when we had to take down our entire community because there was too much liability around it because we were a media company, right? So like for me, of course, the notion of putting things on a site that are infactual or whatever is anathema. But so in this case with 230, what exactly could we reform? What's the language that we would put in there that could make a meaningful difference? And what would the platforms do to fight back?
I'm happy to take it, but I mean, you sounded like a lawyer, I will say. So, wow, Jason. I think that's the question, frankly, in this type of room. The Vargas v. Facebook case that I mentioned is one where we have tried to argue some sophisticated and new things around 230, actually. Part of that being not to gut 230, but to bring laser-like reforms that would allow liability where conduct or content by the platform is something that we can reach the platform for. What that means is when an algorithm that a company has created is then employed with discriminatory outcomes, they should be liable for that discrimination. That is one of the easiest reforms that we can make. And what it means is that that algorithm is itself conduct that the company engages in. They created it, they impose it, it creates certain outcomes. It is content as well, which is one of the ways to also circumvent 230. And because we don't now have a reform 230, we have been arguing both. And I hope that isn't too wonky. We have been trying to get around this 230 exemption. 230 is, of course, the protection for third-party and intermediary companies to be able to be removed from liability for things that happen. And frankly, historically, I have to say 230 has been a godsend. The idea that at the early internet stage, if Francis posts on my little tiny blog something horrible to another user, Tristan, these are things I didn't vet in advance with them. So, then I, as the blog owner in 2001, might be liable for. The stakes and sort of the volume were so much smaller back then. And so the premise when 230 was created was to try to safeguard those tinier entities of some sort. Facebook is no such tiny entity now. So how we reform it is important. And we have to sort of, I think, impose a civil rights framework on the impetus, the urgency of why a reform needs to get at what conduct companies should be liable for.
I want to unpack something from the two of them. So part of what was implicit in what Jason was talking about, and I want to differentiate between talking about conduct and talking about content. When we write a law that says something like you are liable for each piece of content, there's an assumption there that you can even take down each piece of bad content. The reality is language is nuanced. It encodes lots of meaning. There's a difference between the words and like what the significance of the words is. And AI will never, ever, ever, until we have like strong AI that could govern us itself, we'll never have AI that can actually say this is hate speech or this is terrorism promoting content and not terrorism discouragement content. And so laws that say you're liable for each individual piece of content means you're going to sacrifice a huge amount of good content that looks similar. When it comes to conduct, we're saying, let's look at patterns of behavior over time. You know, you had 100 chances at bat to make this platform safer, and you took 10 of them. But you had 100 chances to make the platform more dangerous, but more profitable, and you took 90% of them. I think they should be liable for making that pattern of choices over time.
Just to add, if you take, the problem is it's not really just about the content, it's about design choices that really create and structure the environment. So if you took every piece of what anyone in this room would agree on, calling it disinformation or hate speech or toxic stuff or violence or misogyny or any of that, you took all that off of Twitter. Let's say we live in our new Section 230 utopia. We're all living in it. Okay. If I'm still paid by Twitter 100x more for adding inflammation to cultural fault lines by spinning partial truths, I'm still living in a civil war for profit machine. Really important, right? Meaning if I say, here's the hypocrisy of this one example that the other side did, and that gets boosted 1,000,000 times X, and I'm paid more and start doing social learning, that the thing I should start doing is finding more division for profit. Division is not illegal. And paying people more when they incite division versus not inciting division in the form of not dollars, but in the form of likes is not illegal. And if China chose to say, we are going to put a 10% boost to everybody around the world in every native language who said that Taiwan was always a part of China, on the day that I invade Taiwan, nothing about that is illegal according to our current laws. So the conversational framework that we need is so much more, and that's what I hope this council will do together, is that the issues are so much more nuanced and pervasive than about content at all. And I think more like fire codes, safety codes for buildings. You were mentioning safety codes for buildings. I think that's, we don't have that practice of design. And right now, the incentive to maximize engagement per Max's wonderful book is that through the engagement maximizing incentive, everybody is incentivized to create digital gladiator stadiums rather than digital schools, libraries, and safe public spaces, right? And so we have to change that.
We focus on content because it's what we see, and we confuse the symptoms for the problem itself. Misinformation is not the problem. Hyperamplification of selective material is the problem. Good speech not answering bad speech is the problem. Those are the things we should be tackling.
Tristan once said to me, we have to have freedom of speech, but we don't have to have freedom of reach. And that really is a summation of what you just talked about. Max, you want to add something to that? Or
I think that is exactly on the nose. That my understanding of the Section 230 debate is that we're basically talking about what do we do with actionable content, and that's a very important conversation, but that the perhaps more fundamental and harder and maybe more important conversation is what do you do with non-actionable content, which is the much more pervasive influence from these networks.
okay, maybe one more question. We got 3 minutes. Sherry.
Francis, you mentioned earlier in your remarks that there's a change that the platforms could make that would help prevent or help cut teen suicide by 25%. What are those changes?
I'll give you a really, really simple one. So we have known for years that sleep deprivation is one of the top risk factors for a variety of harms to children. So it's one of the top indicators for mental health problem development, literally dying from accidents, substance use, both stimulants and downers, because if you start getting more depressed, you start to numb yourself with things like alcohol. Right now, the way the platforms try to help show we care about you, we're going to help you go to bed, is they'll pop up a little thing saying, hey, it's 10 o'clock. Do you want to go to bed? And you may all be better people than I am, but I just snooze that, right? I'm like, oh, dismiss. Imagine a different world. So imagine a world where at 10 a.m., after some kid has stayed up till 2 or 3 doom scrolling, at 10 a.m. when they're hungover on Instagram in math class and miserable, a thing pops up and says, when do you want to go to bed tonight? Instead of saying, their mom wants to go to them at 10, but they want to go to bed at 11, say 11. And for 2 hours before 11, Instagram gets a teeny bit slower and a teeny bit slower and a teeny bit slower. You don't even notice it's getting slower. We've known for 20 years, 25 years, that if you make an application a little bit slower, people use it way less. The crazy thing is that code is live on Instagram today. But the only way you get to that code is if you're hacking Instagram. Like if you're stealing content from Instagram, they don't take your account down, they slow your account down. So you get less and less. Because if they take your account down, you'll just get a new account. That single feature, I bet, would save a huge number of lives, because those kids that are stuck in loops of despair would actually get to go to bed and reset. And so it's little things like that, you know.
And by the way, Apple could implement the feature called the slow me down feature inside of the screen time app. That would take an engineer like a day or two to implement. And tomorrow you could have 4 billion damn phones basically saving people's lives by that one change, not just in one Instagram app, because we have one company that does the right thing, but we have an entire ecosystem governed better through the attention comments. And just so you know, in China, it's almost like Xi Jinping saw the social dilemma, because in the last year, they instigated these reforms. So for kids under 14, I think, at 10 p.m., social media just goes lights out, and it opens up again
18.
at 6 in the morning. And we were just recently at a conference in the Nantucket Project, and Andrew Yang and Larry Lessig were there, and he had everybody raise their hand and said, if your parents in the room, how many of you would like to live in a room where kids on any social media product, that the social media goes just lights out at midnight, it opens up again at 7 in the morning? And he had 100% of people's hands go up. What are we waiting for? This is not even that hard.
I'll give you one more example. So the thing I'm always talking about is, what would our internet environment look like if it was designed to respect autonomy and dignity? So one solution is a paternalistic system where we say certain kinds of content can't be on there. We know in the case of kids who do self-harm, who get eating disorders, that they start to fall into these algorithmic holes. Right now, Facebook has done surveys where they can tell you which topics are correlated with kids having bad body image. Imagine a world where Instagram said to a kid, hey, I notice you're looking at a lot of content that people associate with feeling bad. Do you want to keep looking at this much content in this topic? Do you want a little bit less? Imagine we respected their ability to make choices instead of just being pulled by the algorithm. All those kids who are seeing their psychologists and saying, I know this content is making me feel worse, but I can't walk away, they could meaningfully walk away. So designing for autonomy and dignity really, really matters and puts the control back on individuals.
It's friction, it seems like, is the common kind of keyword and the common. And I think a lot about, because it's hard because it is so effective and it cuts so clearly against the financial interests of it's the exact opposite of what they're designing their products to do. I think about the cigarette comparison a lot, just because I find it a useful way to think about it. And the friction that we ended up with on cigarettes is not to make them less addictive, because how do you incentivize the companies to do that? But you can't smoke in restaurants and you can't smoke in offices. And that is a very different kind of roundabout backwards way of getting at friction, but it is something that interrupts your ability to use this addictive product, and that over time changed the social norms around it in ways that saved, untold numbers of lives, even though the core product is fundamentally the same. So I don't know what the one-to-one is for that with Facebook or YouTube or TikTok, but it's something that feels like it's a promising direction.
So in the early 80s, I worked with Dick Durbin to pass a ban on smoking in airplanes. And just to show you how hard this stuff is, we lost the vote 3 times. That's how hard this is. Wow. We were up against very wealthy cigarette companies who did not want that to pass. So history meets the future.